The Mongols conquered China in 1279. Within 50 years, they were writing poetry in Chinese, worshipping Chinese gods, and ruling exactly like the emperors they replaced. Kublai Khan, grandson of the man who burned northern Chinese cities to rubble, sat on a Chinese throne, adopted Chinese court rituals, and commissioned Chinese scholars to write his biography in the Chinese classical tradition. The conquerors had conquered China, and China had conquered the conquerors. This wasn't an accident, it wasn't luck, and it certainly wasn't weakness. 300 years later, the Manchus swept down from the north, overthrew the Ming dynasty, and established the Qing, China's final imperial dynasty. By the 19th century, the Manchu ruling class had largely stopped speaking Manchu. They dressed in Chinese robes, practiced Chinese customs, governed through Chinese bureaucratic systems. The foreign dynasty had become more Chinese than the dynasty it replaced. One more. After a century of what Chinese historians call the century of humiliation, opium wars, unequal treaties, foreign concessions carved from Chinese territory, China emerged from the ruins of World War II not diminished, but rearmed with ideology, territorial ambitions, and a strategic patience that would reshape the 21st century. Defeat. Every time. Turned into something else entirely. The question isn't whether China does this. The question is how. Most people look at Chinese history and see a civilization that survived. But survival is the wrong frame entirely. Survival is passive. What China does is active, deliberate, systematic. And understanding the mechanism changes how you read every headline about China today. The conventional story frames Chinese resilience as cultural stubbornness, a deep attachment to traditions so powerful that no foreign force could extinguish them. There's true H in that, but it misses the more sophisticated dynamic. China doesn't just cling to identity under pressure, it weaponizes that identity. It turns the act of being conquered into a process of conquest by other means. The insight at the center of this video isn't about Chinese exceptionalism or civilizational superiority. It's about a set of repeatable strategic mechanisms that emerge from China's specific geography, scale, and historical memory. Mechanisms that have appeared in recognizably similar forms across radically different dynasties, conquerors, and centuries. We're going to examine 4 of them. The absorption mechanism, how China digests its conquerors. The patience mechanism, how strategic retreat becomes an offensive weapon. The narrative mechanism, how defeat gets rewritten into destiny. And the adaptation mechanism, how China adopts enemy tools without adopting enemy identity. Each one is distinct. Together, they form something that no other civilization has managed with such consistency. A system for turning loss into long-term gain. And by the end of this, you'll see exactly why China's behavior in the South China Sea, in trade negotiations, in its response to international pressure over the past decade, follows patterns that are not just historically familiar, they're historically inevitable. The first mechanism is the oldest and arguably the most remarkable in all of human history. China doesn't resist cultural invasion, it digests it. To understand why, you need to understand the scale problem. China has always been enormous. In 200 BCE, during the Han Dynasty, China's population was somewhere between 50 and 60 million people. The Roman Empire, at its peak centuries later, governed perhaps 70 million across a far larger geographic area. China's population density in its core Yellow and Yangtze River valleys was extraordinary, and that density created something that worked like cultural gravity. When the Xiongnu, nomadic horsemen from the northern steppes, raided Han China for generations, the Han didn't simply absorb the punishment. They also began a quieter, slower process of pulling Xiongnu groups into Chinese economic and cultural networks. Trade relationships came first. Intermarriage followed. Within several generations, communities that had been raiders became farmers, then taxpayers, then subjects. The gravity worked. The mechanism isn't assimilation in the Western sense. It doesn't require force or formal policy. It requires mass. When you are surrounded by tens of millions of people who share a language, a writing system, a cuisine, a set of rituals for birth and death and marriage, and you are a conquering army of tens of thousands, the mathematical pressure runs in one direction only. You adopt or you remain permanently foreign. And permanently foreign means permanently governing a hostile population. The Jurchen Jin dynasty, which controlled northern China from 1115 to 1234, understood this explicitly. Jurchen leaders issued edicts forbidding their people from adopting Chinese clothing and customs, a clear sign that the pull was already strong enough to require prohibition. The Patmersanti edicts failed. Within generations, Jurchen nobles were competing to demonstrate their mastery of Chinese literary culture. This pattern has a contemporary echo that's easy to miss. The millions of people of Chinese descent living across Southeast Asia, in Malaysia, Indonesia, Vietnam, Thailand, have maintained recognizable cultural identity for generations, despite enormous pressure to assimilate into majority cultures. The same gravitational logic operates in reverse. When you have sufficient cultural mass and institutional density, you resist absorption even in diaspora. China understands this about its own civilization, and it shapes how Beijing thinks about soft power today. Confucius Institutes, Chinese language media, overseas community networks. The mechanism scales. The second mechanism looks, from the outside, almost like weakness, and that's precisely why it works. In 200 BCE, the Han Emperor Gaozu suffered a catastrophic military defeat at the Battle of Baideng. The Xiongnu Chanyu, their supreme leader, surrounded the emperor's force of 320,000 men with 400,000 cavalry. The Han army was trapped for 7 days in freezing conditions. The outcome could have been the end of the Han dynasty before it truly began. The Han response was not heroic resistance. It was tribute payments to the Xiongnu, diplomatic marriages of Chinese princesses to Xiongnu leaders, and trade arrangements that looked, from the outside, like submission. For nearly 70 years, China paid and appeased. Han emperors chafed at the humiliation. Chinese court officials debated whether the Xiongnu should be confronted directly. The answer, for 7 decades, was no. Then Emperor Wu came to power in 141 BCE. After 70 years of tribute payments, 70 years during which Chinese agriculture expanded, the economy deepened, military technology improved, and the Han state consolidated its internal administration, Emperor Wu launched an offensive that broke Xiongnu power permanently. The patience hadn't been passivity, it had been preparation dressed as defeat. You see this mechanism operating across Chinese history with striking consistency. During the Song dynasty, when northern invaders repeatedly pushed the court south, losing the Yellow River Plain, losing Beijing, losing the historical heartland, the Song didn't collapse. They retreated, stabilized, developed the most commercially sophisticated economy in the medieval world, and waited. They didn't always regain what they lost, but they outlasted empires that looked far more powerful at the moment of confrontation. The modern manifestation of this mechanism is visible in how China handled the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis and subsequent Western pressure over trade imbalances. Rather than dramatic confrontation, China absorbed the pressure, continued accumulating foreign exchange reserves, continued deepening technological infrastructure, and continued the slow process of internationalizing the yuan. The strategic patience wasn't patience for its own sake, it was time converted into capability. The third mechanism operates not on the battlefield, not in the palace, but in the mind. Specifically, in how defeat gets recorded, interpreted, and transformed into historical meaning. China has one of the longest continuous historiographical traditions in the world. The role of official historians, who documented dynasties, interpreted events, and constructed the narrative of legitimate rule, was not merely academic. It was political infrastructure. And the concept at the center of this infrastructure was the mandate of heaven. The mandate of heaven, Tianming, was the idea that rulers governed with divine sanction and that military defeat or natural disaster signaled heaven's withdrawal of that sanction. This sounds like a justification for failure. It is actually a mechanism for transforming failure into usable political narrative. Here's how it worked. When a dynasty fell, the event didn't read as the triumph of the conqueror. It read as the moral failure of the previous dynasty. Heaven had removed its mandate because the old rulers had become corrupt, cruel, or incompetent. The new ruler, even a foreign conqueror, received the mandate not because they were foreign and powerful, but because heaven had chosen them to restore order. This forced every successful conqueror to immediately begin behaving like a Chinese emperor, or their legitimacy evaporated. The Qing dynasty, Manchu, not Han Chinese, understood this with surgical precision. When they conquered Beijing in 1644, they performed elaborate Confucian rituals for the fallen Ming emperor. They buried him with imperial honors. They publicly blamed the Ming's fall on Ming officials' corruption, not on Manchu military superiority. They presented themselves not as conquerors, but as restorers of order. The mandate mechanism meant that conquest required cultural conversion, and cultural conversion meant the conquered civilization had shaped the narrative of its own defeat. What this created, over centuries, was something remarkable, a historical record in which foreign conquest is consistently reframed as Chinese renewal. The Yuan dynasty, Mongol, is presented in Chinese historical memory primarily as a Chinese dynasty with a Mongol founding family, not as a foreign occupation. The Qing is remembered as the dynasty that expanded Chinese territory to its greatest historical extent, even though the Qing were Manchu. Defeat becomes complicated, then integrated, then re-narrated as part of a continuous Chinese civilizational story. Today, this mechanism operates through what scholars call China's century of humiliation narrative, the framing of the period from the First Opium War in 1839 to the founding of the People's Republic in 1949 as a temporary national wound, now healing. The humiliation isn't forgotten, it's operationalized. As motivation for development, as justification for assertiveness, as historical evidence that external powers cannot permanently subordinate China. Defeat in this narrative is not an endpoint. It's a plot device in a longer story that China's leadership explicitly controls. The fourth mechanism is where China, a strategy becomes genuinely modern and genuinely dangerous to underestimate. After the First and Second Opium Wars, in which British military technology demonstrated the catastrophic gap between Chinese and Western industrial military power, Chinese officials had a choice. They could reject Western technology as incompatible with Chinese civilization, or they could adopt it selectively without adopting the worldview that came with it. The self-strengthening movement of the 1860s through 1890s was China's first systematic attempt at this fourth mechanism. Officials like Li Hongzhang argued explicitly for adopting Western guns, ships, and manufacturing while preserving Chinese ethics, governance principles, and social structure. The slogan was, Chinese learning for fundamental principles, Western learning for practical use. The movement ultimately fell short. The Sino-Japanese War of 1895 revealed that technological adoption without systemic reform had limits, but the underlying logic of selective adoption survived into the next century and beyond. Mao's China borrowed Marxist-Leninist organizational technology, the mass party, the ideological campaign, the five-year plan, and remade it into something distinctly Chinese. Soviet advisors arrived in Beijing after 1949 and found a Chinese Communist Party that accepted Soviet technical assistance while resisting Soviet political control with a stubbornness that eventually produced the Sino-Soviet split of the early 1960s. China would take the tools, it would not take the instructions for how to use them. The contemporary version of this mechanism is visible in China's approach to the internet, to artificial intelligence development, and to global trade architecture. China participated deeply in the World Trade Organization, the rules-based international trading system created primarily by Western economies, long enough to develop the manufacturing base, technical expertise, and capital reserves to begin constructing alternative institutions. The Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the Belt and Road Initiative, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. These are not anti-Western in design. They are parallel architectures, built with tools borrowed from the existing system, designed to reduce dependence on that system over time. Adopt the method, retain the autonomy, a pattern first visible in the 19th century, now operating at global scale. 4 mechanisms. Thousands of years. One underlying logic. And once you see it, it becomes almost impossible to look at Chinese foreign policy, or Chinese history, the same way again. Here's what connects these 4 mechanisms at their root. They all treat time as a strategic resource. Not weeks or months or even years, decades and centuries. The absorption mechanism works because cultural gravity operates slowly, almost invisibly, until suddenly it's irreversible. The patience mechanism works because capability built over years defeats force applied in moments. The narrative mechanism works because the long historical record eventually buries the short-term record of defeat. The adaptation mechanism works because selective borrowing, pursued patiently, produces independence that pure resistance never achieves. This is not unique to China in the sense that no civilization has ever thought about time strategically. The Byzantine Empire survived for nearly 1,000 years after Rome fell through similar mechanisms of strategic endurance, selective adaptation, and narrative legitimacy. What is unusual is the consistency with which these mechanisms appear across radically different Chinese political systems: imperial dynasties, republic, communist state. The specific institutions change. The underlying temporal logic doesn't. It also creates a particular kind of challenge for external powers trying to interact with China on shorter timescales. Democratic governments operate on electoral cycles measured in years. Corporate strategies extend perhaps a decade. When these meet a strategic culture that measures competitive advantage in generations, the asymmetry isn't military or economic. It's temporal. China is playing a game with different rules about when the game ends. That doesn't mean the mechanisms are infallible. The self-strengthening movement's partial failure showed that selective adaptation has limits when the system requiring reform is the mechanism of selection itself. And there are historians who argue that the century of humiliation narrative, however politically useful, has locked Chinese foreign policy into a reactive posture that creates unnecessary confrontation with powers that don't actually seek Chinese subordination. The patience mechanism requires knowing when to stop being patient. That judgment call has not always been made correctly. But here's what the historical record is clear about. For more than 2,000 years, every major external power that encountered China, expecting to find a civilization that could be permanently subordinated, fundamentally redirected, or culturally dissolved, found instead that they had underestimated not just China's resilience, but China's strategic intelligence. Here's the uncomfortable question that historians rarely ask directly. What happens when the opponent understands the strategy? We are, arguably, in that moment now. Western strategists, business leaders, and policymakers have spent the last 2 decades increasingly studying exactly the mechanisms described in this video. The term strategic patience has entered Washington policy vocabulary. Academic work on Chinese historical statecraft has moved from obscure journals to national security briefings. The opacity that once made these mechanisms so effective has partially dissolved. And yet the mechanisms continue to operate. Because understanding a strategy and having the institutional capacity to counter it are not the same thing. You can know exactly how cultural gravity works and still find, 30 years later, that your manufacturing base has relocated to Chinese supply chains. You can understand strategic patience and still be structurally incapable of MATC. Hing it with a 4-year political cycle. China's strategic inheritance isn't a secret weapon, it's a civilizational habit. Embedded in institutions, in historical memory, in the way leadership frames every setback as a temporary condition within a longer trajectory. That's not propaganda. That's a genuine worldview forged across centuries of exactly the defeats we've been examining. The real question isn't whether these mechanisms work. History has answered that. The real question is whether any external actor, or for that matter any internal one, can interrupt a pattern that has outlasted every empire, every conqueror, and every confident prediction of Chinese decline. 2,000 years of evidence suggests a particular answer. But history, to its credit, has never guaranteed the future. What do you think? Is this pattern finally meeting its match? Or is the 21st century just the latest chapter in a very old story?